This elderly woman was threatened and assaulted by her rich young neighbor from an influential family when she called the police. The officer just laughed at the older lady, but when everyone saw a picture and found out who her son was, they went pale. Ashley packed everything she needed to take to her home on the coast: 3 changes of clothes, some medicine, and a few packets of seeds for her lovely house garden, a place that gave her a sense of pride for all the work she had dedicated to transforming it. She couldn't forget Farm, her tiny kitten, and prepared his crate. Farm could sense his owner's excitement and persistently followed Ashley around the house as she got ready for the trip. Ashley planned to stay at her beach house for a week. She was anxious to smell the sea again, to listen to the gulls while walking barefoot on the sand, to go snorkeling and see the colorful fish in the reefs. She also looked forward to taking care of her garden, full of ideas for making it even more beautiful. It was 7 years ago, after her son John died in a terrible work accident, that she had bought her house in the suburbs, devastated, the elderly woman dominating her thoughts and feelings since the accident. Ashley considered her son a true hero. He served twice in Iraq and even had a Silver Star Medal for bravery from the Army. She kept this medal and other mementos in a drawer next to her bed. She had cried herself out until she felt completely dry, with no more tears to shed, before she could finally accept that her son had truly departed this life that would never be seen again. Ashley also struggled 20 years ago when her husband died of a heart attack. But then she had little John to dedicate herself to, and he became the undisputed priority of her life. For most of her adult life, Ashley was a history teacher, a very skilled and engaging educator who could always make her classes seem interesting to teenagers. She thought that retiring from the classroom would mark the beginning of a new reality. But it was her son's death soon after that really showed Ashley what it is to have a life divided into before and after, in the most tragic and painful way possible. One thing that helped Ashley out of her almost permanent state of grief was growing flowers in her home on the coast of fact that seemed to bother some of her acquaintances. They couldn't understand why a woman of her age would want to own property near the beach. They even insinuated that our grieving was affecting her ability to think straight to these people. Ashley always responded with a mysterious smile. She owed no one an explanation, and in fact, she never regretted having bought that house. The land was not very developed, but there was a nice flat piece that she wanted to turn into an oasis of colors and scents, having never attended to a garden before she became an avid student of flowers, plants, and weeds. A hobby that soon consumed most of Ashley's time. She and Thumb took a bus as she was in her 70s, and no longer drove. She ascended the tall steps with her suitcase, as she could hardly wait till she knew that in just over an hour, she would finally be together with the beautiful flowers that awaited her in the garden. The trip passed quickly, and soon woman and kitten were once again in their second most favorite home. It sat on a quiet, shaded street only 3 blocks from the beach. But as she went through the gate, she froze as she took in the scene. What the hell had happened here? Who could have done this to such defenseless beings? She couldn't understand what she was seeing. Letting go of her suitcase and setting Thumb's box in the ground actually covered her face as she began to cry. She could feel her wrinkled cheeks burned with anger. Someone had turned her perfectly trimmed along into a huge pile of trash. Her beautiful garden, her oasis, her refuge was strewn with empty beer bottles, cigarette butts, and plastic wrappers. Ashley had never found her garden like this. Who could have committed such barbarism? Despite the state of her garden, she could see no one else there. So she went to the street searching for the culprits. There was a line of cars down the street, and music coming from her neighbor's house. They must have been holding some kind of meeting or party. Could they have had something to do with the destruction of her yard? Although she considered the possibility, I actually thought it best not to jump to conclusions. After all, she had not caught anyone in the act when she returned to her house, picked up her things, and went to the kitchen. Perhaps her favorite room in the house, partially because of its view of the garden, calmer now with a cup of tea. Warming her hands, she was still trying to understand why someone would do such a thing, All that garbage in such a well-kept and beautiful space. What was the point for her? It was unlikely that it had been done by some random person going to or from the beach. While ruminating on these thoughts, as she began to hear music and drunken voices coming from the house next door, she felt the beginning of a migraine, so she closed all the windows and blinds. To help clear her mind, she decided to clean the house. It worked, as she didn't even notice when the day had ended and a full moon had taken over the sky. The party next door seemed far from over, even with the windows and doors closed. The laughter and shouting seemed to grow louder by the minute. It was clear that if it continued at that pace, she wouldn't be able to sleep soon. The music became even heavier, like someone had discovered the bass boost switch on the stereo. The booming bass began to resonate through the rooms of the house, making the walls vibrate. Tom was so scared that he had hid under the bed and wouldn't come out for anything, not even to eat. First, it was her garden, now was her patience. Even her kitten couldn't handle the cacophony. Ashley decided that if she did nothing, she would have a night from hell. She gathered her courage while she got dressed, left the house, and knocked on the neighbor's gate. They were singing together to the loud music, so they probably couldn't hear her. She shouted, knocked on the gate more firmly, and pressed the doorbell numerous times, but no one answered. But Ashley was determined to keep trying. Even if she had to break that gate. After 15 long minutes, a woman about 25 years old opened the door with a glass in her hand. "Hi, can I help you?" The young woman asked. Ashley took a deep breath. "And do your best not to be rude." "Good evening, young lady. My name is Ashley, and I live next door. Could you please turn down the volume a little? It's scaring my cat." The woman smiled slightly in response, took a sip of vodka from her glass, and replied, "But why? It's a party in my house. We are celebrating. I have the right to listen to music, right?" Ashley sighed, looking at the girl. She knew she must have been drinking for hours, and there was no point in arguing with her if she didn't see that the person at her door was an older person and deserved respect. There wouldn't be much else to expect from her. Besides, the young woman seemed ready to defend her right to listen to loud music. Even if she had to beat up an elderly woman to do it, Ashley bowed her head and walked slowly back home. She would have to take sleeping pills at night if she wanted to get any rest. But at least now she was sure that her neighbors were rotten enough to have actually been responsible for all the trash that was dumped in her yard. The next day was torture for the older woman. She had a full-blown migraine, and her blood pressure was higher than normal. Trying to stay positive, she concentrated on the fact that the party was over and Thumb had come out from under the bed and assumed as normal perch on her lap. Surely should be able to rest much better than Night. Actually spent the whole day feeling strange, always looking at the clock. It was only as the sun began to lower over the horizon that the sounds of people and music began to once again echo from the house next door. By the time it was dark, the music seemed even louder than the day before. The cat screeched and darted under the bed, only as terrified eyes can be seen in the dark. The old woman felt the music pulsating in her chest, as if the stereo was right there in her own living room. She thought they were doing this on purpose, and felt harassed by those rude, drunken young people. One more night like that, and she would go crazy. Ashley decidedly picked up the phone and called the police. She didn't want to resort to that, but she was sure that her neighbors would never listen to her to avoid complications. Perhaps the police could handle it better, though the older woman was a little embarrassed that she couldn't resolve the problem herself. Ashley stuttered on the phone as she complained about the noises coming from her neighbors. She was clearly agitated by the situation. The officer on the other end of the line asked her to calm down, as a police car would soon be there. However, the officers soon extended to more than an hour of waiting, and worse, just when the police car parked on the street. The neighbors lowered the volume until it was barely audible on the street. The policeman took statements from Ashley and her neighbors. The elderly woman became furious when the officer told her that the neighbors claimed that they hadn't turned the sound off once and didn't know they were bothering anyone. After all, no other residents had made any complaints. The same young woman who had talked to Ashley the night before said that it was all in her old neighbor's head That none of this had happened actually turned red with anger, and then was shamed as she couldn't think of any response to the girl's lies. The officer said that Ashley needed to be more careful and warned that calling the police to make a false allegation could result in a fine as well as waste law enforcement time. The officer walked away with a look of disgust on his face. She could not believe that she was going through such a situation at this stage in her life. At least all that confusion had cleared up some things. Ashley learned that our 25-year-old neighbor's name was Chloe Sherman, daughter of a well-known businessman. She also no longer had any doubt that her neighbor was bothering her on purpose. 10 minutes after Ashley had returned home, the music started up again. The old woman picked up the phone and dialed the police once again, asking them to come immediately this time, because she was going crazy with all the noise. Ashley didn't know how the neighbors were monitoring the street, but right when the police pulled up, the roaring party suddenly dropped to a low murmur. The attending officer said that he had already warned the lady, so this time it was an infraction. He added that he didn't like to waste his time, and that there were people in town who needed the police for real problems. Ashley tried to argue that the party and neighbors were only lowering the volume when the police arrived. But Cloud denied it, saying that all this was just an old lady's hallucination. Finally, the policeman fined the old lady and demanded that she not lie anymore. Otherwise, she would face harsher consequences. The next day, as she was exhausted, she wanted to avoid getting in trouble with the authorities and being seen as a liar, even more so since she was the victim in the story. Around noon, when the elderly woman was preparing the table to eat, she heard the doorbell. As she reached the door, she saw a young man in his mid-20s with an arrogant look on his face and a beer in hand. "Is everything all right?" Ashley asked. "Hi, my name is Leo. I'm Chloe's boyfriend from next door. I want to understand what all the noise was that you heard yesterday," the boy asked. The old woman noticed the young man's hostile tone and felt that the conversation could quickly escalate. So she simply said that she had hardly slept that night, and then she would call the police again if the noise continued. The young man laughed ironically, saying he was sorry, but everyone in the house had had a stressful semester in college, and they were all in town to enjoy the last day other vacation besides. They were young, and that's what young people did. But apparently we're bothering a bitter old woman who doesn't even remember her younger days anymore, right? He actually was unresponsive, struggling to believe that she was in fact hearing those things on her own doorstep, but the situation was about to get much worse. "Look, you should know about the police here. See, my girlfriend's father is Mr. Sherman, a businessman who basically owns this town. No one will touch his daughter." And this is when the young man changed his tone of voice, sounding even more intimidating. "But be careful, because the same cannot be said about you, ma'am. If it's peace and quiet you want, then find an asylum." Not a beach town actually flinched at this direct threat from the young man. Leo took a last sip of his beer, crushed the can in his hands, and threw it into the lady's garden, saying, "In this filthy garden, you don't even take care of your house, do you?" Ashley had never felt these emotions before. She was nearing the end of a 7-year mourning period for her son, plus the memories of her husband. All she wanted was to be at peace and take care of her flowers and garden. But now, not only was she considered a senile old woman and a liar by the police, she had also been threatened in her own home. Later that day, when the reveille of Chloe, Leo, and their friends resumed, she cried silently, petting Thumb, who was still scared, while she felt the vibration of the music resonating in her stomach. This time, she didn't have the courage to call the police, remembering Leo's threat from the previous day. The next day, she felt really sick. Her migraine was back with a vengeance, and her face was full of worry and sadness. Seeing no other option, she dressed in her best clothes from her suitcase and built up the courage to order a cab to the police station. When she arrived, she soon felt that no one there would take her seriously, or that they already knew her as the newest crazy old lady in town. Her mouth and throat were parched from the nervousness she felt. When she bent over to take a drink from the water fountain, Ashley's purse fell to the floor, scattering all her belongings among coins, documents, and makeup. There was a photograph of her son John in the Silver Star Medal, He had one for his extraordinary bravery in Iraq. The situation, which was already difficult, became even more embarrassing for the elderly woman who tried to quickly pick everything up off the floor. But at that moment, the police chief stooped down to help the flustered old lady. "Why isn't anyone helping?" he said loudly, scolding all the officers who are not helping an elderly woman in obvious need. "Thanks, but I'll fix it. I'm so clumsy." "Sorry," Ashley replied. "No need to apologize. It's our job to help," and the man began to reply, but suddenly went mute. When Ashley looked at him, she saw the policeman holding the photo of her son and the Silver Star medal. "Where did you get that photo? And that medal, you wanted to know? That's my son John. It's been 7 years since he passed." The chief helped the lady to her feet and led her into his office and served her some hot coffee. He said his name was Howard Sloan and that he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Ashley looked confused. So the officer told her his story. Howard and John, the elderly woman's son, had served together in the army at the American base in Baghdad during the war. The two fought side by side, dodging minefields, mortars, and enemy snipers. Day after day, the two relied on each other to survive and carry out their missions during a war. There are days without battle, but there are no easy days, which is why soldiers cherish their military friendship so deeply in one episode that the policeman would never forget. He and John were in a group of soldiers surrounded by enemies. An adversary approached the group silently from behind, in at Howard's chest in the crosshairs of his rifle. But before he could fire, John managed to throw his friend to the ground and fire at his attacker. There was a split second that prevented Howard from returning home in a wooden box. When the two friends' deployments came to an end, their lives took different directions, to the point where contact between them became increasingly rare until it ceased altogether. It was only now, almost a decade later, that John was crossing Howard's path in a completely unpredictable way. Now, the chief understood why he had never heard from John again and was saddened by the news. But if his friend's mother was in a police station, Howard had an obligation to help her, first out of respect, and because that was his job, but also on behalf of his deceased friend Ashley, described in detail what was going on between her and her neighbor and boyfriend. She mentioned the garbage found in the yard, the loud music, and the direct threat she had suffered. The police chief was already laying out a plan in his mind for the next 2 days. Chloe Sherman and her guests continued to throw raucous parties from dusk until dawn, but this time Ashley knew what to do. She called the police chief, who came directly to her house, not to her neighbors, and appeared in his private car instead of a patrol car. When he arrived, he was able to verify that the sound really was deafening. Using his cell phone, he filled the room, reverberating with sound, the frightened cat under the bed and the elderly woman's distress. Then Howard used a decibel meter to verify the volume of sound inside Ashley's house. Luckily, and to their surprise, they were able to film the exact moment when Leo and some other boys threw a bag of garbage over the fence that separated the two houses and into Ashley's yard. But none of this compares to what happened next. Howard Sloan knew that loud music and littering would not result in very severe penalties, so he wanted to see if he could witness and record a new threat against the old lady to do this. He hid in his car while actually rang the doorbell of Chloe's house to politely ask them to turn down the sound when Chloe appeared at the door. Her boyfriend was with her, both of them completely drunk from the car. Howard couldn't tell exactly what they were talking about, but he could tell that the argument was becoming heated. Chloe pushed Ashley, who almost fell over, and then Leo threw his drink at her. At that moment, Howard ran out of his car and flashed his badge, Chloe, not quite understanding his situation due to her alcoholic haze. "Celebrate it. You're finally here. I guess my dad greasing your pocket is a good thing, huh?" Howard informed COVID she was wrong. He was there to arrest her and Leo in front of all their guests for assaulting their elderly neighbor. Chloe just laughed and said, "Do you know who I am? Call my dad. He'll take care of everything." It's true, Howard reasoned Mr. Sherman would indeed be getting a call soon, now that his own daughter has admitted his involvement in a kickback scheme that needs to be thoroughly investigated. Chloe and Leo left in handcuffs in the car and were taken to the police station. A few months later, the investigation against Sherman began, and he was called to give a statement. The investigation led to a state lawsuit against him for paying bribes and overbilling in a number of construction projects around the city. The lawsuit continues to this day, and the scandal tarnished the influence that Sherman and his family had in the region. Chloe and Leo lost a lawsuit filed by Ashley, based on the evidence and testimony of Chief Howard. Both had to pay a compensation of $60,000 to the elderly woman, in addition to having to perform social service collecting garbage. They will spend their next 3 summer vacations cleaning the streets and parks of the city. Actually felt better. Now she didn't know if those youngsters would learn any lessons, but at least her image was clean again, and her garden was once again the prettiest on the street, perhaps the prettiest in the whole city. If you like this story, I asked you to please leave a like, and this other video that is appearing on the screen now will probably move you as well. Have a good day and see you in the next video.